Tricia, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you? Yeah.
I'm okay, but I think a lot of nonprofits right now are struggling, and it feels almost next to impossible to stay on top of how everything is developing. I mean, from what you're seeing, do you have any practical insights right now and things nonprofits should consider?
Yeah, I mean, if we just look at today, we're recording this on February 20th, right? I think we can honestly say that there is a lot of potential disruption going on right now when it comes to different revenue streams for nonprofits specifically. And this is really highlighting, I think, what our topic is today, which is the importance of your policy. So yeah, I think you had mentioned to me before that there's this saying that we always talk about. It's we can't control what happens to us, but we can ultimately control how we react to it. And then I also think adding on to that, we can definitely control how we can plan for it as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you know that I've always taken that kind of what I call stoic approach to focus on what you can control. But I mean, the reality of it is the reserves are probably more important than ever right now. But just to be clear and really just dive into it, how do you define operating reserves?
Yeah, so I look at operating reserves in the net assets bucket, but more specifically, those that aren't tied up with restrictions. So on the statement of financial position for a nonprofit, I'm specifically looking at the net assets with without donor restrictions, excuse me. And so those net assets with donor restrictions, when I look at that compared to the annual cost or spend with the total expenses, including program services and supporting services, I'm looking at that ratio. So if your annual spend, for instance, is $10 million and you only have $5 million in your net assets without donor restrictions, you have a ratio of 0.5, which equates to 6 months of net asset reserves.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's I like that approach, and it's very simple. Like it's very clear which bucket of net assets you're looking at, and out of that, you can effectively calculate like a burn rate of sorts. And so I guess then you did mention the ratio, and it's a good segue into what I think we get asked a lot, right? So like, what is an ample ratio? What are some of the benchmarks maybe you're seeing, and how do those change during times like this?
Yeah, I mean, we went from a period pre-COVID where I think we were really emphasizing at least 6 months of reserves, and then COVID hit, right? And then the pandemic just disrupted a lot of organizations, and most importantly, I think it disrupted the C6 type of organizations, right? Our C3s, we saw them from a philanthropic standpoint, they really actually increased and had a lot of gain in that time period. So their reserve policy might honestly be a little bit different than if we look at an association. So we were looking at 6 months of reserves post-COVID, especially for C6s, we were really emphasizing about a 12 months. So 1.0 ratio, right? $10 million of spend to $10 million of net assets without donor restrictions, just because of we saw so much disruption with the annual meetings, et cetera. Now, again, it goes back to the board strategy, I think. So while I can sit here and say that I would like to see at least 6 months for every organization, I think a minimum of 6 months is a good starting place. There may be other organizations out there that need a little bit more. If we look at the climate today, we have a federal freeze right now, or a review of federal funding really that was stopped for 90 days, right? That was the executive order that went out. And so that 90 days, that is an area where you want to make sure you have enough cash on hand, investments on hand to meet payroll, et cetera. So now we're looking at a reserve policy of at least 90 days. But again, that just covers the bare minimum, right? That's all that is. So you really have to sit down with the board, look at your risk management, and determine what do we need to plan for the future? What are the potential disruptions that can occur? What have we seen in the past, like with COVID, and now with an administration change when that's coming up and down the road 4 years from now? Again, what are we looking at? So I really think it just goes back to, again, the risk management standpoint and talking with the board and governance.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned this because this is going to be naturally my next kind of follow-up question. And you mentioned risk management. You mentioned not once. And so, what are you seeing maybe as far as perhaps best practices on what we more broadly, I suppose, call enterprise risk management, right? That's a word we keep hearing a lot. in general as it relates to board strategy and the general management of risks. So anything in particular that stood out to you across perhaps your client base?
So I think again, it goes back to the industry in which the organization operates. It also goes back to who your constituents are, right? Are you serving vulnerable populations? Are you serving a membership base that perhaps is in the gas and oil business? It really just depends. And I hate to say that, but that's really why it's important for management and the board to sit down and look at those items. Now, we have great tools and technologies. Like, for instance, when I'm looking at risks for my audit engagements, I'm going to Chat GPT and I'm asking Chat GPT, hey, in this particular industry, what should I be concerned with? What are the risks? So that's a great starting place. We have so many tools and resources available to us. We don't have to scour the internet for days on end anymore to determine what's going on. We can just ask an LLM and it'll spit out some information for us. Now, again, that requires some vetting. That also requires you to take some of that information and put it into perspective with your specific organization that you're working with or for. But again, the enterprise risk management standpoint, when we look at nonprofits in particular, we want to look at the top 5 risks. We're not in this space where we're working with the PCAOB, for instance, and we're really honing in at Fortune 500 organizations who need to really look at the top 50 risks, right? We really want to identify what those top 5 risks are. And I think right now, as of today, looking at disruption, change in the administration, and some of the things that are going on is likely one of those biggest risks. In fact, we've got a great workshop that we do and collaborate with NC State and our risk advisory services does. And we are talking about this actually this afternoon on the day of our recording. So there's a lot of good information out there available on our website as well. And we are certainly willing to help with any type of risk management response that an organization would need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, you said this multiple times, and I completely agree. This is a process that's very unique to their organization, right? You really have to understand your business drivers, your organization in and out. This is something that, we go back to our college days when we had to take those classes when you do like a SWOT analysis. This is
Yeah.
very clearly right fitting into that external threat category. But we can offer the perspective as outside advisors, if you will, things to consider. And I like the suggestion about ChatGPT because it's just a tool to help you, if nothing else, generate ideas that may not immediately come to you. But
Right.
maybe switching gears a little bit, because I know in fairly recent years, there's been some, if I understand correctly, changes on the audit side with respect to disclosures and perhaps maybe even audit procedures surrounding going concern. How would you see this kind of related? I mean, what we're talking about in effect is financial sustainability, right? Is there any impact? Like, are auditors going through what's happening now and potentially it could impact 12/31/25 year-end audits and going concern?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's impacting our 12/31/24 audits as well that we're currently working on. If you think about it, we as auditors are required to look at the ability for an organization to be a continued going concern, which that sounds negative, but a continued going concern is actually a positive. That means they will remain in business. So I do want to clarify that and make that known for our audience. But we're required to look at that 12 to 18 months, really 12 months from the date of the issuance of our report, right? So when we're looking at our 12/31 year ends, we may not perform the audit and issue the financial statements until, let's say, mid-March of 2025. And so now we're looking at March of 2026 is, can they be viable? Are they sustainable? Now at 12/31/2024, we have several organizations that we currently work with who were fine. As of today, some of them have already shut down. Some of them have already ceased 75% of their operations, laid off workforce, furloughed workforce. So we are looking at that heavily. Now they are still required to have some of those regulatory compliance audits as a part of this process. So unfortunately, that is something, yes, that we will have to disclose substantial doubt of a going concern, as well as we are looking at organizations who do have some significant federal funding, for instance, where we're required to disclose that subsequent event related to some of these executive orders that could impact them. Whether that's a significant impact, we're not exactly sure yet because everything is still kind of up in the air. We're still in this wait and see approach. And that's why we are adding that emphasis in there, but it's not necessarily to a point from our perspective where we're looking at a substantial doubt.
Okay, great. Interesting. And so going back to like the discussion surrounding risk management, I kind of maybe put it perhaps into more of a qualitative bucket, right? The initial discussion is going to be what are those risks? And then likely the next logical step is now trying to assign some kind of value, financial value to that risk. So have you seen in across your clients and what you're just more generally seeing any particular maybe financial modeling techniques that have stood out to you, or just generally like the more quantitative process that you would maybe make some suggestions on, or do you feel like again that's pretty subjective to the organization?
It's subjective, but at the same time, some of the things that I do like to see is a lot of our organizations who are actually going through this practice of ERM, right? Enterprise risk
Hmm.
management. They've identified their risks and they've put them on what we call a heat map. And that heat map kind of weights it. So you're not looking at it from a financial number perspective per se, but perhaps that goes into some of what of your risks are, because enterprise risk management really goes above and beyond just the numbers, right? It goes into operations. It goes into your reputational risk, perhaps, depending on like where you are. So right now, your reputation risk, if you're an international nonprofit global organization, might be really high, just because of where we are today. And so when we're looking at a association who maybe is in the semiconductor space, for instance, maybe that is a little bit low because, we know that that industry in particular won't be disrupted too much. So I really like the heat map because what that does is it really identifies when you weight it, what your really key and top risks are. And again, this can shift on a monthly basis, especially right now. But it's able to allow you as management as well as the board to identify what those top things are and how to respond to them. So again, you might identify 20 different things. Here are your top five, but what one do we need to focus on the most? Where do we need to spend our time? It's kind of like what we do from a risk perspective on the audit. Where do we need to hone in and audit the most, right? Where do we need to put our procedures in at the most? So it's kind of the same process from that perspective. And what it does is it allows you to take a game plan, get your action plan of what it might be. Again, this goes to disaster recovery and business continuity. That is a part of the process as well. And so you're able to take that and develop that plan and be able to respond appropriately. So when something does break down, you have something in place to at least start from. It may not be perfect, but you've got a starting place. And
Yeah.
this is where I also think, yeah, we kind of touched on a little bit early on, but diversification of revenue is of utmost importance when it comes to being a nonprofit, right? If you have all your eggs in one basket or mostly in one basket, one small little disruption could completely wipe away all of your revenue.
Hmm. And that is something that is, I mean, right, we have the revenue disclosure, rather, the footnote disclosure surrounding concentration of revenue. But if I remember correctly, it may not necessarily be by revenue source. I believe it's like by a major customer, perhaps, or so. But be that as it may, that's more of an internal focus, right? You need to understand your organization. You need to, like you said, see those concentrations and act accordingly. And going back to your comment about the heat map, if I remember correctly, it's more of a visual, right? Like the structure of it, the format. And I think that's impactful because a lot of this is happening at the board level. The discussions there's no way you should not be including your board. And so
Absolutely.
beyond, and I've almost always found that visuals are incredibly, incredibly impactful when you get to the board level because just presenting the numbers, the details, it tends to be too much to really make sound, quick, strategic decisions. What else besides something like a heat map have you found to be particularly helpful at getting more board engagement in these kind of strategic decision making?
Yeah, I think a lot of my organizations who really sit down and think through their forecasting on a 3 to 5 year model is really engaging from a board perspective. It also allows you to say, hey, if we have enough reserves and we want to put more money to building out a certain infrastructure within the organization, whether that is if you're an association, for instance, a new LMS, a learning management system, or perhaps you are a C3 who is working in vulnerable populations and you want to start a program in a new country or a new portion of the United States that you haven't been in before, you're able to take a look at that as you forecast out and determine okay, we're going to spend this much here. How many years are we going to give it? What does that forecast potentially look like? And how are we going to get the revenue to be able to recoup that funding loss, for lack of better words, right? As we build that out and we put the money into it where we really see it being the most impactful. So being able to really truly forecast, I don't see a lot of organizations forecasting beyond 1 year, right?
Mhm.
And that to me is, while you have a strategic vision, you're not forecasting from a dollar perspective, and being able to tie those two pieces in, I think, is really valuable.
Mhm. Great. So what else, other than a lot of the things we touched upon, right? And you and I are just scratching the surface. But
Yeah.
what other resources, I mean, are you seeing? It feels like it's just a nonstop barrage of news and articles, and everybody's trying to stay on top of it. But what would you recommend for somebody that's just trying to navigate it all without going crazy?
I would say pick your items that you want to spend the most time focusing in on, and determine from there where you're going to get your source. Obviously, we've got a federally funded resource webpage now that is out there. We have our enterprise risk management, our risk advisory services side that you can also take a look at. NC State has a wonderful program when it comes to enterprise risk management as well. So being able to go to those credible sources is really of importance, and being able to vet those sources and making sure that you're getting the information in the proper way. But again, it's also going to go back to deploying your board members. Your board members, remember, are also fiduciarily responsible for the organization. And so getting their involvement and being able to take some of their volunteer time on practices like this. Now, I know not every organization has that flexibility with their board members, right? Because depending on the industry that you're in, but if you do have that flexibility, being able to engage them in that process and being able to find some of those resources to bring to the table to have a discussion, I think is really valuable. I was on a board here locally where I live, and every year we would have a retreat. And part of that retreat would say, here's our strategic plan for the next 3 years. And with that, we would say, what do we need to change? What do we need to update? What do we need to revalue for ourselves? But then also bring to the table some of those resources that you're looking at for that information, and being able to come together for more than just a 1 hour meeting, an all day meeting, and having just an open dialogue and discussion to see what's top of mind for each of the individuals, because the hope is that your board is diversified as well in their experience and their expertise. And so being able to have all of those different perspectives is really of importance. So while I can't say that there's a online resource, right, with all of the news and the place that you should go, I really do think that governance is a wonderful starting place, because a lot of times they are coming with a lot of different perspectives, as I mentioned.
Mhm. Yeah. And the last plug I'll probably make for ChatGPT too is I found it, because there's so much just information flowing. At times, if you give it context, say, I'm kind of in this position, this is what my focus is. Can you help summarize maybe the top articles right now out there that are speaking to this subject? And to your point about credibility, you obviously always want to verify the source itself, but at least it
Right.
can tell you what's right now, maybe more succinctly summarize everything and give you a starting point. But the
Yeah.
networking and the thought sharing is,
Mhm.
most that I've spoken to, they've said that that's probably been the most impactful for them. So I really like that suggestion.
Absolutely.
Great.
And then I also think, like, other organizations are a great collaboration space if you're in a particular industry, reaching out to your colleagues. I mean, we see it all the time in our industry now, right? In accounting, in our profession, our public accounting profession, we are way more collaborative than we were 10 years ago. And
Hmm.
it is a wealth of knowledge and information to just talk with one another. So those
Hmm.
cohorts are wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. As the saying goes, we're all in it together, and the more that we can share and work together to get through this, I think the easier it will be for everybody. Excellent.
Absolutely.
Well, as always, Tricia, thank you for sharing all of your experiences, your knowledge, and yeah, if again, and if anybody has any follow-up, I think GRF is doing some of that sharing, right? Thought sharing. We're getting a lot of our clients together and helping to facilitate that. But as always, feel free to reach out to any of us, and our information's on the contact page. So we'll get through it.
Thanks, yeah.
Thank you.